The city of Jericho stood mighty and unshaken, its towering walls a symbol of strength and defiance. No army had ever breached its gates. No enemy had ever dared to challenge its power. But little did Jericho know, its greatest threat wasn't an army with swords and spears, but a nation led by faith. As the Israelites marched in silence around the city, their footsteps echoing through the streets, an invisible force was at work. Something was about to happen that would shake history forever. But how could walls so strong crumble without a single weapon? This is the story of the impossible, the Battle of Jericho. For years, the Israelites had wandered the wilderness, waiting for the moment they could enter the land promised to them by God. Under the leadership of Joshua, they finally stood at the threshold of Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey. But their path was blocked by the formidable city of Jericho, known for its towering walls and strong defenses. Conquering it seemed impossible by human standards, yet Joshua knew that victory would not come by might alone. It would come through faith and obedience. Before engaging in battle, Joshua sent 2 spies to scout the city. These men found shelter in the home of Rahab, a woman who, despite her past, believed in the power of Israel's God. She hid the spies from the king's soldiers, recognizing that Jericho's doom was inevitable. In return for her help, she asked for protection when the city fell. The spies promised her safety, instructing her to tie a scarlet cord in her window as a sign. With that, they escaped and returned to Joshua with their report. The people of Jericho were terrified, for they had heard of Israel's God and his mighty deeds. With newfound confidence, Joshua prepared his people for battle. But this would not be a conventional war. God had a plan unlike any before. He commanded Joshua to have the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant and lead the army in a silent march around the city for 6 days. On the 7th day, they would march 7 times, blow their trumpets, and then, through an act of divine power, the walls would fall. It was an unusual strategy, but Joshua knew that obedience to God's word was the key to victory. The Israelites obeyed, rising each day to march around the city. From inside the walls, the people of Jericho watched in confusion and fear. They had expected an attack, but instead, they saw a procession of priests, soldiers, and the ark circling their city in silence. The tension grew with each passing day, but the Israelites remained steadfast, trusting that God's plan would unfold in his perfect time. Jericho was one of the oldest and most well-fortified cities in Canaan. Its massive walls were said to be impenetrable, standing as a symbol of strength and security for its people. The residents had prepared for a long siege, confident that no army could breach their defenses. However, they did not anticipate the kind of battle that was about to take place. The king of Jericho, upon hearing that the Israelites were near, had sealed the city gates, allowing no one to enter or leave. Inside, fear gripped the people. They had heard of the miracles that God had performed for Israel, the parting of the Red Sea, the destruction of Egypt's army, and the recent crossing of the Jordan River on dry land. They knew their city was next, and their hearts melted with dread. Rahab, however, did not share in their fear. She had put her faith in the God of Israel, believing that he alone held the power over life and death. She gathered her family in her home, just as the spies had instructed, and tied the scarlet cord to her window. It was a simple act, but it marked her as one who trusted in God's mercy. Outside the walls, the Israelites continued their silent march. They did not raise their weapons, nor did they utter a word. The only sounds were the steady footsteps of thousands of men and the occasional blast of the priests' trumpets. The people of Jericho must have wondered what this strange procession meant, but they would soon find out. For 6 days, the Israelites followed God's command, circling Jericho once each day. The routine was the same. The priests carried the ark, the trumpets sounded, and the army marched silently. No battle cries, no arrows, just a seemingly endless procession. It was a test of patience and obedience, for victory had not yet come. Inside Jericho, confusion turned into anxiety. The people had braced for an attack, but none had come. Instead, they watched as their enemy walked around their city day after day, growing more unsettled with each passing moment. Some may have mocked the Israelites, while others trembled in fear, sensing that something supernatural was at work. The Israelites, however, remained focused. They had witnessed God's power before, and they knew that His timing was perfect. Each step was an act of faith, trusting that the promise given to Joshua would come to pass. They did not question the method, they simply obeyed. Finally, the 7th day arrived. This time, the instructions were different. Instead of marching once, they were to march around Jericho 7 times. Then, at Joshua's command, they would shout with all their might. This was the moment everything had been leading up to. As the sun rose on the 7th day, the Israelites assembled, knowing that this was the day of victory. They marched around Jericho not once, but 7 times. The anticipation built with each lap, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. On the 7th and final lap, Joshua raised his hand. The priests blew their trumpets with a mighty blast, and then, at Joshua's signal, the entire army let out a thunderous shout. The silence of the past week was shattered by the roar of thousands of voices crying out in unison. At that moment, a great trembling filled the air. The earth shook, and the mighty walls of Jericho, those towering fortifications that had stood for generations, began to crack and crumble. Before the stunned eyes of the Israelites and the terrified inhabitants of Jericho, the walls collapsed completely, leaving the city defenseless. The Israelites rushed in, seizing the city just as God had promised. The victory belonged not to their swords or strength, but to their faith and obedience. The battle had been won, not by human power, but by the hand of the Almighty. As the dust settled and the echoes of the Israelites' shouts faded, the sight before them was one they would never forget. The once impenetrable walls of Jericho lay in ruins, reduced to rubble by the power of God. What no army could have accomplished with siege weapons or brute force had been done in an instant by divine intervention. The path to victory was now wide open. Joshua and his army wasted no time. With a battle cry, they charged into the city, encountering little resistance. The people of Jericho, stunned and terrified, were unable to fight back. Their great walls, which they had trusted for protection, had betrayed them. Their fate had been sealed the moment they stood against the God of Israel. Amidst the destruction, Joshua remembered the command of the Lord. Jericho was to be utterly destroyed, and everything in it devoted to God. The city was not to be looted for personal gain. Only the silver, gold, bronze, and iron were to be collected and placed in the Lord's treasury. This was not just a battle. It was a declaration that Israel's victories belonged to God alone. Yet, in the midst of judgment, there was also mercy. Rahab and her family, who had remained inside their home with the scarlet cord as a sign, were spared. Joshua ordered the two spies to retrieve them, fulfilling their promise. Rahab, once an outcast, was now welcomed into the people of Israel because of her faith. The destruction of Jericho was unlike any other battle in history. The entire city, along with its inhabitants, was destroyed as an offering to the Lord. This was not an act of cruelty, but of divine justice. The people of Jericho had long defied God, indulging in wickedness and idolatry. Their time for repentance had passed, and judgment had come. The Israelites understood that this victory was not their own doing. They had followed God's instructions to the letter, and He had given them success. Joshua ensured that every treasure taken from the city was brought to the treasury of the Lord, as commanded. There was to be no personal gain. This was a sacred conquest. However, Joshua also gave a solemn warning. He declared that Jericho was cursed, and anyone who attempted to rebuild it would do so at a great cost. The city, which had stood as a symbol of human pride and defiance against God, was to remain a ruin, a testament to His power and judgment. As the Israelites stood among the fallen walls, they were filled with awe. This victory had shown them once again that obedience to God led to triumph, while defying Him led to destruction. The battle was not won by swords or strategy, but by faith. While Jericho's fate had been sealed in destruction, Rahab and her family experienced the mercy of God. As the city burned around them, they were led safely out, their lives spared because of one woman's faith. Rahab had believed in the God of Israel when others had not, and that faith had saved her. Joshua and the people honored the promise made to her. She and her family were taken outside the camp of Israel, where they were given a place to dwell. No longer was Rahab just a foreigner or an outcast. She was now a part of God's chosen people. Rahab's story did not end with her survival. In time, she fully embraced the faith of Israel, eventually marrying an Israelite man named Salmon. Through her lineage, she became an ancestor of King David and, ultimately, Jesus Christ. Her story was a reminder that God's grace extends to all who believe, regardless of their past. Her scarlet cord, once a simple symbol of hope, became a sign of salvation. Just as she had been saved by her faith in God, so too would future generations find salvation through faith in Jesus, the Redeemer who would one day come. Though Jericho had been conquered, danger still lurked among the Israelites. Despite God's clear command that all valuables be devoted to Him, one man disobeyed. His name was Achan, and his greed would bring disaster upon Israel. Achan had secretly taken a beautiful robe, silver, and gold from Jericho, hiding them in his tent. He thought no one would notice, but he had forgotten one thing. Nothing was hidden from God. His act of disobedience would soon have severe consequences. Unaware of Achan's sin, Joshua led the Israelites to their next target, the small city of Ai. Confident after their victory at Jericho, they expected an easy battle. However, when they attacked, they were soundly defeated. 36 Israelite soldiers lost their lives, and the army was forced to retreat. Joshua was devastated. He fell before the Lord, crying out for answers. Why had they failed? Had God abandoned them? The Lord's response was clear. Israel had sinned by taking what was devoted to Him. Until the sin was dealt with, they would not have His blessing. To uncover the guilty party, Joshua gathered the tribes of Israel before the Lord. One by one, they were narrowed down until Achan was identified. Faced with the truth, Achan confessed, admitting his greed and disobedience. But his confession came too late. His sin had already brought disaster upon Israel. God's justice required action. Achan, along with his stolen goods, his family, and his possessions, was taken to the valley of Achor. There, he and all that belonged to him were destroyed, just as Jericho had been. This act was harsh, but it served as a warning to all. Sin had consequences, and disobedience to God could not be taken lightly. With Achan's sin purged from Israel, God's favor was restored. Joshua led his people back to Ai, this time with God's blessing. The city was conquered, and Israel continued its journey of claiming the promised land. They had learned a hard but necessary lesson. Faith and obedience led to victory, but sin led to downfall. From that moment on, Israel was careful to follow God's commands fully. The conquest of Canaan was far from over, but they now understood that victory was not in their strength, but in their faithfulness to the Lord. The Battle of Jericho was more than just a military conquest. It was a spiritual milestone for Israel. It was the first great victory in their journey to claim the promised land, and it set the tone for all that was to come. They had learned that faith and obedience were the keys to success, and that God's power was greater than any obstacle before them. Jericho's ruins stood as a lasting testament to God's faithfulness and justice. Future generations would look upon its fallen walls and remember what had happened there. They would tell their children of the day when Israel marched in silence, the trumpets blew, and the walls came crashing down. Rahab's story also became a symbol of God's mercy. She had once been an outsider, but through faith, she became a part of his chosen people. Her name would be remembered for generations, not for her past, but for her faith that saved her. The battle was won not by might, but by faith. And through this victory, Israel was reminded that no wall, no enemy, and no challenge was greater than the power of their God. As they moved forward in their conquest of Canaan, they carried this lesson with them, knowing that as long as they trusted in the Lord, no force could stand against them. If this inspired you, please like, subscribe, share, and comment.